Welcome to today's edition of the Obit Page podcast, where we bring you a weekly discussion of interesting obituaries of the past few days, as well as some historic obituaries from time to time. Our goal is to bring you something unusual from those obituaries to give you sort of the rest of the story. I'm Carolyn Gilbert, the founder of International Association of Obituarists, and the co-host for this series of podcasts. Today we have an added feature for your enjoyment. We have a special guest whom I consider one of the outstanding obituary writers in the country. This woman is the recently retired obits editor for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in Atlanta, Georgia. She has that silky southern voice that I've always likened to a vat of mint juleps. Our guest is the inimitable, indomitable Kay Powell. Kay, welcome to our program.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. I think it's an honor to be a part of this podcast. Looking forward to our conversation.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted you on the air today is to share with our listeners what it's really like to be an obituary writer for a major daily. Now, we know that when you call in an obituary, you usually get the classifieds. That's usually what people want. And the information is taken and just kind of filled in on a blank form. And that's not the kind of obituary writer we're talking about here. We're talking about you as a news writer who really researches and fact checks that obituary as a news story. And you, having been the editor for the obituary section of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, had a lot of different responsibilities, but also a lot of different access for some wonderful, wonderful obituaries. So my first question to you is, on a regular day, if there were such a thing, as the obituaries editor, what would your schedule be when you arrived at the office and somebody said, Susie Q has died? What would you do next?
Well, because we ran these as news articles and they were just like any other news article in the paper, you're right. We had to do a lot of research and fact-checking, get outside voices in the article. And as a matter of policy, the AJC ran obits before the funeral because we felt like getting the news out there for people to attend visitation in the funeral was very important. The exception would be for cultural or religious reasons, people who had to be buried within 24 hours. We would write on them after the service. That being said, we started on who we were going to write on that morning when we got into the office around 10 o'clock or so. We would select who we were going to write on, and as editor, I would work with the other reporters to kind of sort out the people that seemed like they'd be the best story. And by 5 o'clock that afternoon, we would have the deadline. We would have chosen a subject to write on, contacted the family, talked to friends, done our research, our fact-checking, written the story, arranged with the family to get 2 photographs of the person, and I had all that wrapped up and ready for print by 5 p.m.
That is a lot of work to do in a short period of time. I know, since I know you very well, that your ability to get information that maybe other writers could not get was very important to the obituaries you wrote. And I want you to talk just a minute about how your ties with the community kind of facilitated your being able to dig out some unusual things for the obituaries.
We took this approach with our featured news obituary articles when we first started doing this back in the mid-90s. And that was we wanted to create a sense of community, both community with the paper and the community among themselves. We wanted the readers to feel ownership in the paper. I have always, in my entire career as a journalist, felt like we had all the power, and we had to use it judiciously and with respect. And I always stressed, I did a lot of teaching on obit writing and tragedy interviewing, that you have to establish credibility, you have to show respect for the person you're writing about and the person you're talking to. There's a great psychology in the words you use and how you approach your family. And over time, you just build up respect and the word spreads. And I don't think I ever had anybody who wasn't willing to talk to me for an obit. I had my regular go-to people, certain public figures that died, and I called one time and asked him, said, I'm writing an obit on so-and-so and want to talk to you about him. And he just told me flat out, he said, Kay, you couldn't print anything I'd tell you about him. So that was one that I didn't
answer.
But you have to do a good job on the stories. You just tell the story honestly and directly. And obits, feature obits in the AJC became a destination. And that's a description I overheard another reporter giving one of his sources on the phone. I didn't make that up. But it did become a destination because people knew they get a variety of stories every day. They learn things about people they hadn't known before. And you just have to enter into a conversation. You've got to ask questions. I always say the question you're afraid to ask is the question you must ask. When people trust you, they just tell you things they wouldn't tell anybody else.
Along that line, I'd like you to talk just a second about the hardest thing about the obituaries assignment, but then the easiest thing about it. Now, you're a people person, so I know parts of it would be easier for you than for any other writer, but there must be some difficult things about that assignment as well.
Carolyn, I really never found that to be so. If you're a good reporter, you know how to get the story. And it might be hard getting a specific story, but in general, I really didn't find it all that hard. We worked assiduously to get funeral homes to buy into what we were doing. Over time, families came to be familiar with those articles and want their family member written about. So there was nothing that was particularly easy or particularly difficult. It was just another day at work writing a news story.
That is a real credit to you and the way you led that group and your own personality. Now, I also know that you have got to have a boatload of obituary memories, of some funny obituaries, some strange, maybe some mysterious sort of obituaries, and there have got to be some funny ones. So share with us a couple of your favorites.
Well, I loved them all. I wrote more than 2,000, and honestly, there was something I loved in every one of them. But when you were just talking about the difficulty in the job, I can give you an example of one story that was difficult to get but had to be written. When Calvin Craig, who was a Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan of Georgia, died, I called his family to get the story, and his wife was resistant. His son was resistant. I talked and talked and talked, and I talked to the son first, and then Mama got on the phone, and they just didn't want anything in there, and I kept explaining to them he was a public figure by his own choice, and, that we needed to write about it, and it went on and on and on, and the mother called the editor of the paper, and the son called me back and talked to me some more, and I told him, I said, if it was my daddy, I'd probably feel the same way. And he said, Kay, we just want it to be fair. And I said, well, I do too. It will be a fair story, and it will be written, but it's very important for you to have your voice in it. So they all agreed to it, and I wrote the story, and I got one of my favorite lines out of it. Calvin Craig resigned as Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, and he teamed up with Zernona Clayton, who was a black civil rights leader here, and they wound up with a dog and pony show that was in demand all over the world. The black woman and the former Ku Klux Klan Grand Dragon, who had teamed up to talk about working side by side. And all the mail for them from Germany, England, for TV magazines would come into Mayor Ivan Allen's office. And Mayor Allen, what he'd do then is turn all the letters over to Zernona Clayton for her and Calvin Craig to decide which ones they want to accept. And Mayor Ivan Allen said, only in Atlanta could the contact with the Ku Klux Klan be through a black woman.
Amazing.
And so that's one that was difficult to get, but an interesting story because it let everybody know what he'd been doing since he left the Ku Klux Klan. A difficult lead I had to write was I did the obit for Dr. Warren Blumenfeld. He was a professor of psychology and management at Georgia State University. But what he was known for was his collection of oxymorons. And in fact, he died in 98, and his books are still available on Amazon.com. And I knew I had to work oxymorons into his story and into his lead, and that's not something I do well. And I called up the features to get somebody to help me with oxymorons, and they wouldn't help me. So this is the lead I finally struggled and came up with on his obit. The novice master, national local authority, an internationally unknown expert of oxymorons, former Georgia State University professor Warren S. Blumenfeld died of colon cancer, and so forth like that. Wow. I had to work at oxymorons in throughout that story. And I've never forgiven one of my colleagues in features who wouldn't help me come up with good oxymorons. But I think it's important for obits to kind of give you a sense of place and time and
sure.
Maybe introduce you to things you didn't know about or give you the backstory on what are commonly known stories. I loved it when I could do an obit and I'd get a call the morning it came out from a family member or a friend saying, I never knew that about my mama, or I had forgotten that about my friend. So I always loved it when people could discover something new.
That's a real accomplishment to do that, especially for a family member. I'm wondering, did you ever get a complaint after you had written and published an obituary?
Oh, yeah. For example, the father of a legislator or Congress member, father of a member of Congress died, and that member of Congress had been sentenced to federal prison. And I mentioned in there, he was the father of so-and-so who served time in federal prison for doing this. And people didn't think that was appropriate. But my approach is our job was to answer questions, not raise questions. And we couldn't have the reader sitting there saying, well, I wonder if that was the father of so-and-so, or the lawyer who made his whole reputation on defending new dance clubs. And his wife was outraged that I would put that in his obit. But that's what he made it. You couldn't overlook it. Or, largest construction contractor in the state of Georgia that was sent to federal prison. You have to mention that.
Sure.
If it's a matter of public record now, there's certain things people might be accused of, but they never really go any further. And in that case, it's a judgment call whether to include it. But, yeah, I would occasionally get complaints if I had something factual in there, like the retired sheriff that killed a 16-year-old girl in his yard. People didn't think that should have been mentioned in his obit, but it had to be part of it.
Sure. Well, I know we have a couple of photos from some wonderful obituaries that you've been associated with. Two closing questions. One, I want you to talk about those. And I know in speaking about one of them, you will get into the role of the obits editor when you have to oversee the obit writers and be of assistance to them. So could you talk a little bit about those two photos from the obituaries?
Well, one is the photo of Annabelle Close, and Joe Geschweiler wrote that obit and did a great job Now, Annabelle Close was an outstanding woman.
And the picture is fantastic.
Annabelle Close was, I think she was, about 87 when she died in 2002. She was president of the Atlanta Astronomy Club, whitewater canoeist, birder, traveled to Canada to see a total solar eclipse, to South America to view Halley's Comet, to Africa on a picture-taking safari. The family sent me a fabulous photo of her on a chute with a corncob pipe coming out of her mouth, and one of our younger reporters came running over my desk the morning that was in the paper, and he was talking about all those things he'd been involved in, and he wound up, I said, Kay, if she wasn't dead, I'd ask her out. And I thought that was a pretty big compliment coming from a young reporter about an 87-year-old woman we'd written that. Now, when I talk about obits having a sense of place and time, one that gives us a sense of time is a great man. He was either 104 or 107. According to the family Bible, he was 107. According to Social Security, he was 104. Claude Miller started his day with some fried streakoline or fatback and a homemade buttered biscuit with brown sugar on it. Then he set out for a day of working at a sawmill, making moonshine and bootlegging on the side. His daughter-in-law was the best interview for that story. It's one of those that wrote itself because She gave such good quotes. She said, he was only in jail one time. They blew his steel up in 1965, but he didn't go to jail for that. It was a different time he was in jail for bootlegging. And Ed, he kept on. She said just recently he had wanted to go to North Georgia and get some apples to make some of his apple brandy. Still at 104, he wanted to keep his hand in. And she told me, well, I wrote this. He was as wily playing checkers as he was at eluding revenue agents for half his life. And he played checkers on a checkerboard he created on a tree stump. And for a sense of place, I've always said, Carolyn, there's an obits goddess that takes care of those of us who write about the dead. This is Thelma Hogan, who was 79 when she died. She lived in Tucker. At Matthew's Cafeteria, a smiling Thelma Hogan called you by your first name, asked after your mama, made sure your cornbread was cooked just like you like it, and hugged your child in her lap while she rang up your lunch on the cash register. She did that about 800 times a day for 43 years. I had that story written and ready to move to the line editor when I was sent the photo to accompany it. And there was Thelma with the cash register open with somebody's precious little baby sitting on her lap. And I said, there couldn't possibly have been a better marriage of photo and story. Yep. And nobody would ever know I wrote the lead before I got that photo. I'm sure they thought I looked at that photo and then wrote the lead.
Well, Kay, you have really pricked our imagination about how these wonderful news obituaries are written and the steps that it takes to get through them. And I want to say to our listeners, I want again to say this has been Kay Powell, who is the former obits editor for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Kay has stories that will just lay you low because, as you can see, she's a very diversified writer. Her obituaries are just fabulous. And I'm very pleased to say that Kay Powell is a Hall of Fame person from the International Association of Obituarists. We knighted her when we had a conference in Bath, England. She has the appropriate trophy to show for it, and we're very proud of Kay. And Kay, thank you so much for being with us today, and we'll look forward to talking to you again.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, Carolyn.
Thank you, Kay.
Well, there's one kind favor I'll ask of you. One